Every September, Wallace Odom handed out 412 lockers, and every September, exactly one of them came back. Not physically. Locker 114 stayed bolted to the wall the same as all the others. Third row from the entrance, main first-floor corridor of Brenner Consolidated High School. What came back was the assignment. The small yellow transfer request slip that landed on Wallace's desk sometime in the first 6 weeks of school every single year, without exception, for as long as he had been keeping track. He had been head custodian at Brenner for 24 years. He had watched the pattern hold for all 24 of them, and according to the logbook he'd inherited, it had been holding for a good while before that, too. The requests were never dramatic. A kid would come to front office, usually alone, sometimes with a parent who seemed a little embarrassed to be there over something so small. The lock sticks a little, they'd say, or the door doesn't sit right, or, more often than either of those, something vaguer that the kid themselves seemed unable to fully explain. I just don't like it. Can I switch? The front office almost always said yes. It was one locker in a bank of 412, and there was never any shortage of empty ones to trade into. Nobody made a fuss about it. Nobody thought about it twice, except Wallace, who had thought about almost nothing else regarding that corridor for the better part of 2.5 decades. He had learned about Locker 114 in his second month on the job, from a man named Pete Salinas, who had been head custodian at Brenner since the doors opened in 1968, and was 6 weeks from retirement when Wallace arrived. Pete didn't train Wallace so much as walk him through the building slowly, room by room, introducing him to it the way you'd introduce someone to a person. He'd talk about the boiler's quirks, the gym floor seasonal creak, the auditorium curtain that always hung crooked no matter how many times you adjusted the rigging. On their third walk to the first-floor corridor, standing in front of the locker bank, Pete stopped and tapped the door of 114 twice with one knuckle. "This one," he said. "Watch this one." "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing you can find," Pete said. "I've checked. Lock's fine. Hinge is fine. Hangs a hair low on the left side. But that's cosmetic. Always been that way. Never affected anything. Kids just don't want it. Every year. Ask around. You'll hear the same thing from whoever's got it this fall. They won't be able to tell you why." Wallace assumed at the time that Pete was exaggerating or passing along some long-running maintenance staff joke as a rite of passage. He didn't think much more about it until Pete, 2 months later, handed him a spiral-bound logbook, not a maintenance record, Pete specified, but something he called the corridor's habits, a phrase he used without any embarrassment, as though the most natural category of information a building could produce. Wallace read the whole thing that first winter. 26 years of entries, most mundane, a door that swelled every August, a drinking fountain that ran warm for its first 30 seconds every morning. But scattered through the pages were the Locker 114 entries. Not every year. Pete hadn't started noting it specifically until 1979, 11 years into the school's operation, when the pattern had repeated often enough to earn its own line. Asterisk September 1979. Locker 114 again. 6th kid this decade to switch out within a month. Nothing wrong with the lock. Checked it myself. Door hangs a hair low on the left hinge, but that's cosmetic. Kids just don't want it. Don't know why. Writing it down, asterisk. Wallace had counted backward. 6th kid this decade. If Pete's count was accurate, the pattern went back at least to the earliest years of the school itself, 1968, 1969, right from the beginning, long before anyone currently at Brenner had been born, long before any rumor could plausibly have taken root and sustained itself. That fact sat with Wallace for a long time. A superstition needed an origin story. This didn't have one. It just had a locker and a pattern, and a building that had apparently been repeating both since the day it opened. Wallace had watched it for 24 consecutive Septembers after that. Every year, a transfer request came in for Locker 114 within the first 6 weeks. Not always the same stated reason. Sometimes a lock, sometimes a door alignment, sometimes nothing more specific than a shrug, but always within that window, and always, eventually, granted. He checked the lock every summer during his pre-year maintenance sweep. It worked fine. He confirmed year after year that the door hung a fraction low on the left side. Cosmetic? Harmless, the kind of thing that existed in a dozen other lockers without producing any pattern. In his 8th year, he replaced the entire locker door and frame assembly, hoping quietly that a fresh, properly aligned door might finally break the streak. That September, the transfer request came in during week 4. New door, same pattern. He wrote in the logbook, in the same plain style Pete had modeled, asterisk replaced door and frame assembly, summer. No structural or cosmetic issues remaining. Transfer request still received, week 4. Whatever this is, it isn't the hardware, asterisk. He sat with that entry for a long time. He had genuinely believed the new door would solve it. Being wrong about that felt different than being wrong about most things at Brenner. It wasn't a mechanical failure he could diagnose. It was a failure of his own theory, and he had nothing to replace it with. In his 14th year, Wallace started keeping something Pete's logbook never included: interviews. Brief, casual, just a friendly custodian asking why a kid had wanted to switch, the way you might ask someone why they preferred one bus seat over another. The answers, across a decade of asking, were remarkably consistent in their vagueness. Nobody ever said the locker was haunted or scary. What they said, again and again, was some version of, "It just felt off. The door didn't close the way I expected." One student, a junior named Priya Chun, put it more precisely than most in Wallace's 18th year. He asked his usual question, expecting his usual vague answer, and instead she frowned and actually thought about it before responding. "It's not that anything's wrong with it," she said. "It's that every time I open it, it felt like a half second off from what my hand expected. Like reaching for a stair that isn't where you think it is. You know that feeling? Where your foot comes down and the step's not quite there." Wallace went home that night and wrote her answer into the logbook word for word, because it was the closest anyone had ever come to describing something measurable rather than merely felt. A half second off from what your hand expected. He started paying attention to the door differently after that. Not the lock, not the hinge, but the exact motion of opening it. He stood in front of locker 114 alone one afternoon and opened and closed it slowly, dozens of times, trying to feel what Priachin had described. He couldn't feel it, but he wasn't a 15-year-old opening it fresh. He was a 50-year-old man who already knew the story. Whatever subtle thing the door was doing, he suspected, might only be perceptible to someone encountering it without the story already in their head to explain it away. Brenner Consolidated High School had been built in 1968, a single sprawling story-and-a-half structure with the flat-roofed, cinder-block functionality typical of the era's public schools. The first-floor main corridor ran the full length of the east wing, lined on one side by classrooms and on the other by the original locker banks. Steel cabinetry bolted directly into the load-bearing block wall, installed during initial construction and never fully replaced in 56 years, only patched, repainted, and reassigned every fall. Wallace knew that wall the way he knew every wall in the building, not through blueprints, which he'd only requested once, but through 2.5 decades of walking past it, patching it, repainting the trim around it. He knew it ran slightly warmer in winter than the corresponding wall in the west wing, something to do with an old radiator line embedded behind the block. He had never had a specific reason to think about the wall behind Locker 114 until his 20th year, when the district sent over a box of original construction documents ahead of a long-discussed renovation project, the first real overhaul the first floor had received since the building opened. He spent an evening with the drawings spread across his desk, mostly out of curiosity, mostly because Pete's logbook had made him the kind of person who read things like this when the chance arose. The wall behind the locker bank showed a feature he hadn't expected: a vertical masonry control joint running the height of the wall, positioned almost exactly at the location of Locker 114. Control joints, he knew from general facilities knowledge, were intentional gaps built into block walls to let masonry flex slightly with seasonal temperature and moisture changes, rather than cracking randomly wherever stress concentrated. A planned weakness, a place designed to move a little, so nowhere else had to. Wallace looked at the drawing for a long time. He thought about the low-hanging hinge Pete had noted as purely cosmetic in 1979. He thought about his own replacement door, hung perfectly level, still producing the same transfer request 4 weeks in. If the alignment problem wasn't about the door or the hinge at all, if it was the wall itself, flexing almost imperceptibly at exactly the point where the locker was bolted to it. Then replacing the door had never had a chance. He hadn't been treating the cause. He'd been treating the symptom's most visible expression, while the wall behind it kept doing what it had always done. He wrote in the logbook that night. Asterisk found original 1968 drawings. Control joint runs vertically through wall at locker 114 position. Wondering if seasonal wall movement, not the locker hardware, explains the pattern. Would need measurement to confirm. Don't have equipment for that. Asterisk. The renovation announcement came 3 years later, in his 23rd year. The district had approved a comprehensive first-floor modernization, new flooring, updated lighting, and, most significantly for Wallace, complete removal of the original freestanding locker bank in favor of new lockers recessed directly into a reinforced section of wall. Wallace read the renovation drawings, and his attention went immediately to the new wall alignment diagram. The reinforced wall would run along a slightly different plane than the original, shifted inward to accommodate the recessed cabinet depth, and the new alignment ran directly through the position of the original control joint, with no indication in the drawings that the joint's function had been considered at all. If his theory about the wall was right, and he had no way to fully confirm it, whatever subtle seasonal movement had produced 56 years of the same locker's abandonment pattern was about to be built directly into a rigid new wall structure with no flex allowance designed in anywhere near it. He raised it with the renovation architect, Denise Alcon-Colbert, at a facilities planning meeting that spring, bringing Pete's logbook, his own continuation entries, and the 1968 drawings showing the original control joint. Denise listened politely. The way people listen to something they've already half decided isn't quite their problem. Her response, when it came, was gentle but clear. "Kids are superstitious," she said. Locker 114 probably picked up a reputation decades ago, and it perpetuates itself every year. New kid gets it. Older kids say something vague. They talk themselves into feeling off, and they switch. It's a social pattern, not a structural one. I don't think we need to design around a rumor. It was a reasonable-sounding explanation. Wallace had considered it himself more than once. But it had one problem he couldn't get past, and he said so. Pete's first entry is from 1979, Wallace said. He wrote it was already the sixth kid that decade. That means the pattern was established well before 1979, close to when the building opened. A rumor takes time to build. It doesn't explain a pattern that strong, that early, before anyone around could have started it. None of the kids switching out today were born when this began. Most of their parents weren't either. Denise was quiet for a moment. She looked at Pete's original 1979 entry again. "I don't have a better explanation," she admitted. "But I also don't have justification to redesign a wall alignment around a joint that might not even be functionally relevant, based on a pattern I can't verify as a physical cause." The renovation proceeded on its original design. Demolition of the old locker bank was scheduled for the coming summer. Wallace didn't sleep well through that spring. He kept returning to the same uncomfortable possibility, that he had spent 24 years building an elaborate structural theory around something that might, in the end, simply be what Denise described. A story that fed itself. A locker with a reputation for no reason at all. Sustained by the human tendency to notice a story once you've heard it and unconsciously produce the feeling it promised. He had wanted for years for Priya Chen's half-second off description to mean something physical, because it gave the mystery a shape he could point to. Wanting it to be true wasn't the same as it being true. He pulled the 1968 drawings out again one Tuesday night and looked at the control joint's position once more. He thought about Pete's plain handwriting. A man who never once claimed to know the cause, only insisted the pattern was real and worth writing down. Pete hadn't needed a mechanism to trust his own observation. He had kept a record and let it speak for itself, trusting someone eventually would have the tools to look deeper. Wallace didn't have the mechanism confirmed either. But not having it hadn't stopped Pete from writing the first entry in 1979, and it wasn't a reason to let the record end unexamined now. 3 years from the wall itself disappearing forever, he requested, at his own expense, a single afternoon with a structural engineer before demolition began, not to fight the renovation. He made clear, only to document the wall's actual behavior before it was gone. The engineer was a man named Felix Marchetti, who specialized in older masonry structures, and agreed to the consultation more out of professional curiosity than any expectation of finding something significant. He spent a full day with sensitive displacement gauges mounted across the control joint, measuring movement at the wall section behind locker 114, while Wallace stood nearby with Pete's logbook and his own interview notes. What Felix found, confirmed with follow-up measurement 2 weeks later during a temperature swing, was small but real. The control joint was flexing seasonally by a fraction of a millimeter, well within normal, safe behavior for a joint of its type. Nothing alarming. Nothing that had ever posed any risk in 56 years, or would for 56 more. But that fraction of a millimeter, transmitted through the bolted steel frame mounted directly across the joint, was enough to alter the door's alignment by an amount too small to see or consciously register, but potentially large enough, Felix explained, to produce exactly the sensory mismatch Priya-Chun had described. A door that closed a fraction differently than muscle memory expected, a half-second gap between what the hand anticipated and what it actually felt, repeated every time a locker was used, subtle enough that no student could ever name the cause, consistent enough to happen to every single one of them, every year, since the wall began settling into its seasonal rhythm. It's not dangerous, Felix said, reviewing his measurements. It never was. It's just perceptible in a very specific and subtle way to anyone whose hand learns a locker fresh, without a story already explaining away. Wallace thought of himself, standing in the empty corridor in his 50th year, opening and closing the door dozens of times and feeling nothing at all. He already knew the story. His hand had nothing left to be surprised by. And the new wall, he asked. Felix looked at the drawings. If the new alignment ignores this joint, the movement it absorbed has to go somewhere else, into the rigid new lockers, or into whatever masonry ends up closest where the old joint released pressure. It might be fine. It might produce a new version of this exact problem somewhere nobody spent 56 years watching yet. Felix's findings went into a short supplementary report, which Wallace hand-delivered to Denise's office along with Pete's original logbook, open to the 1979 entry, and his own interview notes stacked beside it. Denise read the report fully this time. She looked for a long moment at Priya-Chen's description, transcribed in Wallace's careful hand. Like reaching for a stare that isn't where you think it is. I was wrong to call it a rumor, she said finally. You weren't unreasonable to think it, Wallace said. I thought it myself plenty of times. It just didn't hold up against 56 years of the pattern starting before anyone alive today was born. The renovation's wall alignment was adjusted at modest additional cost to preserve a functional control joint at the equivalent position in the new structure, not identical to the original, since the wall itself would no longer exist in its old form, but engineered deliberately this time rather than accidentally inherited from a decision nobody on staff had ever known to look for. The old locker bank came down that summer, on schedule. Wallace was there for the demolition and made a point of being present when locker 114 was unbolted and lifted away, exposing the original block behind it, and a control joint visible at last, running its quiet vertical line, exactly where the 1968 drawings had shown it would be. He stood there for a while after the crew moved on, looking at the bare wall. 56 years of a building doing something nobody had asked it to explain, communicated through a half-second of unfamiliarity that 4 decades of teenagers had felt and none of them had ever been able to name. He thought about Pete, 6 weeks from retirement, tapping the door twice with one knuckle and saying watch this one without ever knowing why it mattered. He thought about the logbook and the 26 years of Pete's attention that had made room for his own 24, which had made room, eventually, for a single afternoon with a set of gauges that finally translated a feeling into a measurement. The new lockers went in that fall, recessed and flush, the wall behind them holding a properly engineered joint that nobody using the building would ever consciously notice. Wallace didn't know if some future version of the pattern would eventually reveal itself somewhere else, in some other overlooked seam of the building. He suspected it might. Buildings this old rarely ran out of things they hadn't finished saying. He added a final entry to Pete's logbook before filing it. Finally, in the school's permanent records room rather than his own desk drawer. Asterisk new lockers installed. Control joint preserved. Whatever the wall was saying for 56 years, it should have somewhere proper to say it now. If something else starts up elsewhere, watch it, write it down. Don't need to know why yet. Just need to notice it's happening. Asterisk. He thought Pete would have approved. More than anything else in 24 years. It was the truest thing he'd learned from the man. That a building telling you something didn't require you to understand it immediately. It only required someone willing to keep listening long enough for the explanation to catch up,